Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Napoleon and today we're back with another Enlisted episode, and today we're going to be talking about another squad, and this time we're going to be doing, once again, another event squad. Of course, this video has been made possible for the friends at Discord, meaning that if you haven't liked, subscribed, or joined Discord, I highly suggest that you do. But in today's videos, we're going to be doing the 1st Panzer Division of the 1st Panzer Regiment in Axis, Moscow, which was given to us in the VE Day event, so if you don't have it, don't be afraid. The history of the 1st Panzer Division was that it was formed on October 15, 1935 in the 3rd Cavalry Division and was headquarters at Wehrmacht. It was one of the 3 tank divisions created at the time, and the only 2 being the 2nd and the 3rd Panzer Divisions. Earlier in the year, the Germans had renounced the Treaty of Versailles, which had forbid the country, among other things, from having heavy tanks, or should I say tank forces at all. A German treaty that violated almost by the start by secretly developing tanks from the Soviet Union. In 1938, the division was then participated into Anschluss of Austria and the occupation of the Sudetenland in 1938, and the subsequent invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939. In September 1939, the 1st Panzer Division took part in the invasion of Poland, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw right after 8 days. In May 1940, the division was then part of the invasion of France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It took part in the battles of Sedan, Dunkirk, before swinging to participate in the attack on the Wagen Line. It advanced towards the Swiss border and occupied Belfort before the surrender of France. During the Battle of France, the division suffered relatively and remarkably low casualties for its actions, about 500 men killed in action. It took part in the Operation Barbarossa, crossing the frontier of the German-Lithuanian frontier as part of Army Group North and the 4th Panzer Army. This group was then involved in heavy fighting and by mid-August only had 44 out of its 155 tanks and started less than 2 months earlier. It left in serviceable condition and then continued to advance towards Leningrad until October, when it was transferred to Army Group Center on their advance to Moscow. The division was advancing within 32 meters of Moscow before being forced to retreat due to the Soviet counteroffensive. The division was then part of the Rzhev salient during early 1942, initially being very short on tanks and fighting predominantly infantry until being resupplied during spring. The 1st Panzer Division was then engaged in the defense of the supply lines of the 9th Army on the center of the Eastern Front and Army Group Center. It then suffered even more heavy casualties during the defense against the Soviet attacks of winter 1942 and 43, eventually being transferred back to France in 1943. After refit months in northern France, the division was then sent to occupy Greece in June of 1943 because of the prevalent threat of Allied landings there instead of taking place in Sicily. The division was then participating in dismantling the Italian forces in Greece, and the former defected upon Axis in September 1943. The 1st Panzer Division was then brought up to full strength again in October, receiving a substantial amount of Panthers and Tigers, and returned to the Eastern Front shortly after. It was then consistently thrown into crisis zone, essentially like a fireman division, located in the German front lines, retreating and taking part in the Battle of Kiev, Zitomir, and Cherkasy. The latter saw the division attempt to break through a cauldron but fell short. By March 1944, the division had reduced over 25% of its normal strength, retreating further westwards, and the division was then part of the Clements-Polski pocket, and then from that on it was defense of western Poland and Hungary. It was then engaged in successful operations around Lake Baton and took part in the unsuccessful attempt to break through the siege of Budapest, and once more suffering heavy casualties. During the final months of the Second World War, the division engaged in the defense of Strya, and then after that it retreated westward to surrender to the United States rather than to the Soviets, successfully crossing the demarcation line between the two. It surrendered on the 8th of May 1945 in southern Bavaria, and most of its soldiers were released from captivity soon after. With that said, let's move on to the performance. In terms of the equipment that we have the Flak Panzer I. The Flak Panzer I was developed during the Battle of France, where it was recognized the motorized flak was insufficiently armored. The German Heereswaffendienst decided to combine light anti-tank guns with tank chassis. The chassis of the Panzer I was then used for these conversions simply because it was available. The conversions were done by Stowell. In total, 24 of these vehicles were built, interesting not given accommodation by AA role. Only one unit, the Flak Battalion 604th, Motorized Flak Battalion 604th, was then equipped with the Flak Panzer I. The unit was then assembled in 1941 in the same year and then stationed to Romania. After there, it will be moved into the southern part of the Eastern Front. In service, the vehicles were limited against aircraft, but were mostly used against ground targets because the gun could literally fire straight towards being relatively fixedly mounted. For proper anti-aircraft, a traverse gun was mounted on preferable, but the space was far too limited on the Panzer I chassis for mounts. due to the insignificant progression of the crew of this sort of deployment, they suffered heavy losses. The battalions of the companies were assigned to other units, and the whole battalion was wiped out during the Battle of Stalingrad, even though most of the vehicles had been probably abandoned and destroyed already. With that said, let's move on to the stats. In terms of the stats, the Flak Panzer 1 has a crew of 2 people, has a 20mm flak cannon, of which they has 320 rounds, hull armor of 13, side armor of 13, back armor of 13, front armor of 7, side armor there is no side armor and there is no back armor, so that's going to be very interesting. Perks, drive speed, reload speed, and change shell, which allows you to change shell, and reload speed is very important so you can reload faster, and drive speed is quite interesting, so that's that. Should you get it? And this is only once again available for the VE Day event, and the answer is yes. For a while. For starters, of course. For starters, this is a very good tank. It's good against planes, it's good against infantry, good against some tanks, up to the BT-7. Has better armor than the Soviet version, which is the milk truck, and has literally no armor. That's the downside. It's also very slow, but the gun depression and turret rotation is pretty good for a Flak Panzer, and it can turn 360. Now, should you get it? The answer is yes, for fun, but not for actual tanks. AKA, if you're not using a Panzer II, don't use it. This is a better version of the Panzer II, so if you're starting essentially in Moscow, which I doubt you are, then I suggest that you use this. But in terms of actual grinding, don't use it, unless you have the Panzer II. But that said, that's all it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the Discord, and I'll see you in the next one.